media, how you want to communicate that, through to actually publishing and promoting them. So yeah, broadly we'll do it in 4 sections. So we'll start by thinking about why podcasts. Why would you use a podcast over a video or a blog or a meme or an image? What are they good for, and how do they compare to those other media? And then we'll spend a fair chunk of time thinking about the content. So how you come up with the concept for your podcast, essentially what you want to share, and how to structure it to best represent that concept and the formats that you want to use. And then the second half, we'll talk about, firstly, production. So that's the more, or partly the more technical side, so how to actually do the recording and the editing, but also kind of the editorial side as well, so the planning, and what to do before you actually start recording your podcast. And lastly, we'll finish up with publishing and sharing. So having a think about the different platforms that are available, and really how you build up an audience and get people to listen to all your hard work. To really kick us off, I wanted everyone to have a think about what your favourite podcasts are. So I imagine that most of you will be thinking about your podcast in terms of your job as nurses or midwives, and your QI projects. But for this webinar, just so we really kind of stretch ourselves and think imaginatively, it would be good to think about everything that the podcast can cover. So I've put a few of the podcasts that I like to listen to up here. Some of them are UK, lots of them are American. But I just thought it'd be good for everyone to spend a couple of minutes just thinking about the podcasts that you listen to and what it is that you actually like about those podcasts. What makes them good and useful to you, or entertaining to you, and what keeps you coming back to them. So I'll just give you let's say 3 minutes just to have a think about that, and then if anyone is willing to talk about that afterwards, we can also just have a bit of a chat about that. So yeah, just give you 3 minutes to have a think about that. So some really good comments coming through on the chat. Do put things in the chat as we go along if there's questions you have, or in response to what your favourite podcasts are. Right, so TED Talks are very popular. It should be an honest experience shared. I like that. So to make it very personal. More for TED Talks. Relevant and have personal connection. Yeah. Travel podcast, nice. Some escapism. Inspiration. Okay, so that's been 3 minutes. Did anyone, we've had some great contributions on the chat. Did anyone want to say anything, to share anything about their favourite podcasts?
So we can unmute you. Please raise your hands from the participating teams if anybody wants to speak anything about their favorite podcast. Yeah, can we unmute Praveen Venkatgiri? Yeah, just a second. Praveen, yeah, please go ahead, Praveen. Yeah, Praveen, you are unmuted. Ashna, can you unmute Praveen?
Yes, sir, we have unmuted, sir. Praveen, sir, can you please talk? We have unmuted you.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yes, we can hear you now.
It just depends on the mood. When you want to learn something, probably you would like to go for TED Talks, or you want
Okay, yeah, that's interesting. I mean, they cover such a range. There's really something for whatever mood you're in. Yeah, more for TED Talks on here, and also the person presenting the podcast should have authority on the subject. That's a really interesting point. Okay, we'll just hold those thoughts in your head as we go through the rest of the webinar. We may come back to them later. So let me just go back to my slides. So I put a few of what I think are the big advantages and disadvantages of podcasts here. So first of all, they are technically simpler to do than something like a video, because you just have the audio. You don't have to worry about the visual side of it. There's also the fact that they can really be in any length. So I've seen podcasts that are 2 minutes long, up to, I think Hardcore History, which is a very popular history podcast, the episodes can be up to 2 hours. So because people can listen to them at their leisure, going for a run whilst driving, they can listen to them while doing other things. It really gives you, frees you up on the length. Another technical point, they can be recorded remotely, so you don't have to be in the same place as the person that your participant. And there's less out there of them than videos or blogs, so there's really less competition. And I think, a couple of people said on the chat that they like them to be personal, and I think because they are you're just listening to them, they can be very conversational and quite intimate, and they lend themselves to storytelling, and they can also just be very engaging because of that. And they can be evocative because they leave people to fill in the gaps. You're not giving them a whole picture, as it were, that you were with the video, so you can be very imaginative with them. There are a few disadvantages. When it comes to writing a blog or just putting an image online, they're a bit more complex technically than that. They can be a bit difficult to promote, because if you think about social media, particularly where lots of videos are promoted, it's very visual, and lots of people will even watch videos without putting the sound on. So they can be a bit tricky because those platforms are so visual, and it's to build an audience, people tend to do them as series. So I think it's quite difficult just to do one and promote them at their best as a series, and to have people coming back and subscribing. So those are some of the big disadvantages and advantages.
Thanks, Harriet. I just add I just add a couple of things on that slide in terms of advantages. Is that you can download them, users can download them and listen offline when they don't have an internet connection, which is a fantastic advantage for many people. And related to what you were saying, is that they can be regular, and so people can return to them at kind of regular intervals. Our BMJ Best Practice one, we try and push it out fortnightly. So users can expect to hear from us once every 2 weeks. And I do that myself when I know regularly I'll get a podcast once a week and I'll listen to it. So it's a nice thing to be able to return to.
Yeah, and because of that, people can form almost quite a strong bond with the presenter. You know, they feel like it's someone that they really get to know, and that will keep them coming back to the podcast. So I think really the most important part of producing your own podcast is to think about what you want to say, so that the content. And there's a couple of questions I think it's very useful to ask yourself right at the beginning when you're planning your podcast. So the first is, why are you making the podcast? Who is it for, and what do you want to tell them? So what do you want them to get out of it? And also, what do you want to get out of it? So what is it that you enjoy doing in terms of making the podcast? What would suit you as the person making the podcast? And then secondly, simply, what is the podcast about? What topics do you want to cover, and how do you want to cover them? I thought it might be helpful to give a few examples of how we did that at BMJ. So as you know, Kieran and I do the BMJ Best Practice Podcast. Kieran presents it, I produce it. And we set this up. The premise of it is to give healthcare practitioners a generalist overview of different medical conditions. So each episode we tend to pick a condition. So I don't know, COPD or bulimia, and we'll do an interview with an expert in that area and give users 20 minutes on the basics of what they need to know about that condition, so how to recognise it, what the possible treatment options are, what the prognosis is, possibly how to prevent it, and future ways forward in that condition, future research. So that's the BMJ Best Practice Podcast. Something quite different, we made an internal podcast at BMJ. So this was by BMJ staff for other BMJ staff, and we wanted to show and to share and celebrate the cultural diversity in the company. So the people did it had a lot of fun. We did it through food, so looking at culture through food, and yeah, to help staff get to know each other and get to appreciate the different backgrounds that staff at BMJ had. And then the third one I have up here is another very popular podcast that comes out of BMJ by the British Journal of Sports Medicine, and that is for those working in sports medicine, and it does a really good job of making research very human. So often they're interviews with authors of research papers, and you know, instead of reading a very formal structured research paper, you get to essentially listen to a conversation with the author, and they talk about the paper, but they can also talk around it a little bit more and contextualize it and editorialize it. And the aim of that and the BMJ Best Practice Podcast for BMJ is to get people to know about those websites, those publications, and to encourage them to use them. Did you want to add anything to that, Kieran?
Thanks, Harriet. Yeah, just to add a little bit about BMJ Best Practice. So common questions that I get asked is, where do you get the experts from? And so we interview authors or peer reviewers of BMJ Best Practice content. But if we didn't have these people, I would just look people up on PubMed or Google Scholar, and I would email them. And people often say yes, or they say they can't and suggest somebody else. I can use a stock email explaining what the podcast is, so it's really quite easy and fast to do. You don't have to write the email again from scratch each time. People always ask me, is the podcast going to be live or not live? So it's very helpful and good to reassure them that it's a pre-recorded, not live web podcast. And they're a lot less nervous and anxious about doing a podcast then. And also, importantly, we always email them the questions beforehand, the broad types of questions we're going to ask them, and so they can prepare. And once again, they feel very reassured. We don't need to necessarily stick to the exact questions or the exact order of questions. Often we'll ask a supplementary question depending on their answer, but as long as the experts know roughly the areas they're going to be asked about, then they're usually happy to take part.
Great, thanks, Kieran. Okay, so yeah, back over to you for a few minutes. So if you could have a think about what your podcast concept would be, and I understand many of you might want to focus on QI, quality improvement for that, because that's what you're most likely to be doing. But aside from that, just come up with anything. If you're really into mountain biking at the weekend, or cooking, anything really. Just stretch your brain and just come up with as many as you can in, let's say, another 3 minutes. So we've just gone past, and anyone would like to share them after that would be wonderful. So yeah, I'll give you 3 minutes to have a think about as many podcast concepts as you can. Mm. Okay, we've had some great ideas come through in the chat. I really like some of these. So a positive thought to start the day. I would definitely listen to a very short podcast in the morning on how to get me through my day. Efficient work during a pandemic. Yeah, that's a really broad, very topical subject, obviously. I'll try and keep up with these. How to create a happy work sphere. Yeah, you could cover a really broad range of content in that. Motivation, that's a nice one. Stories from patients about QI project implementation, how it affected them. That's again very nice. Crisis management leadership. Yeah, there's some great, too many for me to read them all out, but there's some, everyone go have a look at the chat. There's some really great ones in there. Did anyone want to talk briefly about their idea, what they would do? Okay, well, do keep feeding them through on the chat and have a look in there, and we'll come back to these later, so don't forget them. Okay, let's look at my slides. So yeah, formats. So this is a key part of your podcast, is to think what format you want to have it in, and you don't have to stick to one format for each episode, but it does help with some consistency, and it's good to understand the formats that you can use. These are 6 of the most popular ones. I would say the most popular one is, it's the format that we use for the Best Practice podcast. So it's where you have an interviewer and an interviewee. So these can be, you can interview someone face to face, kind of in the studio, although your studio could be you know, your office or even a cafe, somewhere like that, or you can do it on location. So it can sometimes be very good to go to you know, where your interviewee works or lives, because it does help people relax. And I'm sure Kieran's got some points on this, but interviewing, it does take a bit of time and skill to get used to it, how to get the best out of your interviewees. And I think the only way to do that is through practice, but you're there to guide them, and it's really your interviewees who are doing most of the talking. Another different format is the solo or monologue format. So that would be something like a TED Talk, where it's one person presenting, talking for 10 minutes, although it can be much longer than that. And it's quite simple to do in terms of the organising and editing, because it's just you don't have to organise anyone else. You do have to do a lot of talking, so you have to keep the energy up, and it's just you for the entire podcast, which it can be very nice to have other people to bounce off. It just depends what suits you best. Conversational or co-hosted is another format. So I don't know if anyone's heard of the Two Dope Queens podcast. It's a very popular one from New York, and it's essentially 2 Black women talking about what it's like to be Black women in America. And it's very fun, it's lively and engaging. They get on very well, and you can really hear that in the podcast. So they can be fun, and it can also be less nerve-wracking if you're doing it with one other person and you have someone else to bounce off. But then you do need to be comfortable improvising, because you can't, if you script a conversation, obviously it's going to sound quite fake and awkward. So you do have to be comfortable with changing things up as you go along. A panel format is similar to an interview format, although you have several people on a panel. So many current affairs podcasts are in that way. It does take a lot of people to organise. So Kieran talked about how we get just the one interviewee for each BMJ Best Practice podcast. But if you have a panel, that's several people that you have to organise for one episode. And that can lead to a lot of conversation, which means a lot of editing later. Non-fiction storytelling, This American Life was the first podcast to do that, and now they've got Serial, which is taking that forward. And that can be one story per episode, or you can have one over an entire series, as Serial does. So they're probably less popular. I mean, I could see them working for something like a QI project, if you want to tell what you did in a story-based way, rather than a formal publication way. And the last one I wanted to mention is repurposing content. So The Moth is one example of this, and there they take the audio from events that they have in real life, and they simply publish that. They get a presenter to do an introduction and to link up the different stories. So that can be great if the audio is out there already, and you can either just use it as it is, or you can edit it down and do links between yourselves to kind of pull it all together, but that is another way of doing things. Kieran, did you have any comments on podcast formats?
Yeah, thanks, Harriet. Yeah, so in BMJ Best Practice, we mainly do interview-led ones on clinical topics, but we occasionally do non-clinical ones, and we have a single interviewee, and it's easiest. And I think if you're starting off, then start with the easiest one. I think that you're right. With practice, you get better and you get more confident, and we've been doing podcasts at BMJ for a good length of time. I'd say it's about 2005, I think we did our first ever podcast, and we've developed kind of skills, but editorial content skills, production skills. So you do get better over time. And it's good to have your niche and to develop skills of interviewing in particular, or whatever format, and to kind of stick to that till you get expertise. I think monologues are possibly one of the hardest to do, and you need to be really, really good to hold people for a monologue, even for a short period of time, 10 or 15 minutes. So an example would be Donald Berwick of IHI. He can do monologues in face-to-face settings, and he can hold people's attention for 45, 50 minutes. I don't know how he does it, but he does. So it is possible, but I think it's one of the more challenging formats.
Great, thank you, Kieran. And yeah, that can possibly, there are lots of different formats that you can think about, and it can feel a bit confusing which to choose. I think a few key things to think about is really what would suit your personality. So if you are Don Berwick and you are fantastic at holding people's attention for 45 minutes, then definitely go and do a monologue podcast. If you would like to do something with a friend that you get on very well with, and you think that you could do it in a very lively, engaging way together, go ahead and do that. Just do think about what you want to do yourself and what you're most comfortable with, and also who you have access to. So do you have someone you get on with very well to co-host? And as Kieran said, it is easy just to email people blind and to get people to interview. But do you work in a hospital and you know lots of people within that hospital which you think would have a lot to give and to share in your podcast, and you think they'd agree to do that, then just think about those people that you have access to. And also, what's the best way to convey your topic? What would suit your topic, and what would make your podcast stand out? So if all the podcasts that you're listening to on a topic are one particular format, what could be another format that you could use to liven that up? So the question, I get asked this a lot, and it's how long your podcast could be. And it's very difficult to answer. I think the answer I often give is, well, how long is a piece of string? So because podcasts people can listen to them as they do other things, they don't have to sit down and take their full attention. You can be very flexible in terms of how long you make them. I think really the key questions to think about is, are you being repetitious? So you want to get your point across, but if you're saying the same thing over and over again, then that will become boring essentially for people. And don't tell them things that they don't need to know. So they're quite simple, but really just think about keeping it lively. Is it going forward? If you have more information that you want to put in it that you think is good and useful and entertaining, people want to hear, then do make it longer. I would say that producing a 20-minute podcast, that's quite a lot of content. That's quite a lot to plan and to record and to edit. So I would say start short and see how you go from there. So I think between 10 to 20 minutes is a good place to start. But then if you do a really brilliant interview and you think, I don't want to cut any of this, or I want to cut very little of this, it's really good, it's really useful, then do share that and keep it longer. Did you want to add anything to that, Kieran?
Yeah, thanks, Harriet. So I just add that for BMJ Best Practice, our podcasts probably around 12 or 14 minutes long on average, but we generally squeeze around 9 or 10 questions into those 10 or 12 minutes. And so nobody is speaking for more than about a minute or 2 minutes at a time before we ask another question or a supplemental question. And I think that really helps people to hold people's attention. And lastly, in terms of recruiting experts, so often when I send my first kind of opening email to invitation email to people asking will they do it, often they assume that, oh, well, I have to come to BMA House, will I have to travel to London? And so when you tell them, no, all you need is a good internet connection and we'll be able to do it in your own home or office, then it's really quite easy for them. They need to book an hour out of their day, and often it takes less than an hour.
Great. Yeah, thank you, Kieran. And we'll talk a bit more about the technicalities of recording. I see there's a question that's come up in the chat about that too, so we'll cover that in a minute. But just before we get there, if you want to take another few minutes really to digest some of that information and think about how you might apply it to some of the podcast ideas that you came up with earlier. So 4 questions that I think it's important to start with. So what you would call your podcast, which of those formats do you think would suit it best, a rough idea of how long you think each episode would be, and then your first episode. So who would you like to interview, and what some of the broad areas that you'd like to include in that podcast. So yes, we say 3 minutes again, and do put them on the chat. I'm really enjoying seeing everyone's ideas coming through.
So Harriet, we've got a question here, how to make a podcast more interesting and engaging. Do you want to take that one, or shall I have a first go?
You start and I'll chip in.
Yeah, so I think it really depends on knowing your audience. And so we make clear with BMJ Best Practice, our audiences are generalist and they're international. And so the content that we create, we try and make it interesting and engaging for them. And also we do regular kind of research, not specifically about podcasts, but generally amongst our users what they want. And what they want, they tell us they want, is they want to be continually updated. So if we know if we include latest updates in the content, it will engage people. And also they want content that's practical, that's useful, about things that can go wrong, pitfalls or in clinical or non-clinical topics. And so we know they'll find that interesting as well. And so we regularly try and return to those themes.
Yeah, I would agree that knowing your audience is really important, and in that way it's always good to do something that you know, so then you'll have an understanding what it's like to be a listener in that world, as well as someone who's producing the podcast. And I say just listen to a lot of podcasts as well, and just think, what is it that holds your attention? I mean, having a good interviewer is very important. So someone who can keep people's attention, but then doesn't make it too much about them and gets the most out of interviewees, puts them at ease, which is partly how they ask questions, but also a lot of the planning. So as Kieran said, with those initial emails can be really important, just putting people at ease, letting them know what exactly is going to happen, and giving them a sense of what you'd like them to talk about. Let's have a look at some other questions that are coming up here. How is conversational and co-hosted podcast different from interview-led podcasts? So I'd say with a conversational, you have the same people on every episode. and they have that conversation, whereas with an interview podcast, that it's a different interviewee every week or every episode. Single person or multiple people, either. Really, you can have just one person involved or many people that you're interviewing. What else?
There's a question here. Is it necessary to make a series of podcasts, or one topic at one time and another the next time?
It's the benefit of doing a series is it makes the promotion much easier, because a lot of podcast sites, so whether it's through iTunes or through SoundCloud, they make a big deal about people subscribing, and then people automatically get that alert when a new one comes through, and it'll automatically download. And that's a really good way of building an audience. So, but I mean, you can make one topic at a time, but you really have to push them. You really have to have the promotion, and we'll talk a bit about this in the next section. Whereas with having a series, it can be much more organic. So slowly people will subscribe, and you'll build an audience up. Okay, so let's move on to the next section, which is recording. And the building blocks of a recording setup. So simply, you'll need a microphone, you'll need some hardware, so that is something to plug your microphone into and record onto. You need some software on that hardware, and you'll need some headphones. So in terms of hardware, it's very likely you'll have something already which is completely fine and suitable and will do the job for recording your podcast. So if you have a smartphone, there's one option. A laptop or a desktop will give you much more options in terms of what you can do with that, in terms of what microphone you can use and how you can record. But any one of those things is probably perfectly fine to record your podcast. I mean, if you're doing it, if you're just sitting down with someone and doing an interview, then your laptop or desktop is fine. If you want to go to someone and record, obviously you'll need something like a smartphone or a laptop, just because it's more portable. The next step up would be a portable recorder, such as this one here. So this is by Zoom, who are a very popular brand. This is H4, so you have 2 ports on the bottom where you can plug microphones into. Whoops. And also ports on the side, and it does have these microphones here as well, so you can simply press record and then direct that, use the inbuilt microphones on the top. But I'd really say it's not necessary to go out and buy one. You probably will have something perfectly fine in your laptop or your phone. The microphone, I say, obviously I think the most important thing to get a good quality podcast. So you probably have an inbuilt microphone in your phone or laptop or desktop, which may be okay, but often they're not great. They can make people sound very far away, and that really takes all the intimacy out of a podcast, and which isn't great. So, but I would say give it a test. I mean, it may be if you're recording someone, if you're sat next to someone and you can just put your phone between you and have it quite close, possibly on a stack of books or something like that, that might be fine. So go away and try that. The next step up with that would be a clip-on mic, because you've got in the top right-hand corner there. So essentially you can clip that onto a shirt or the top of your top or jumper. The other end will go into your phone or laptop, and you record directly to that. You would, if you're doing an interview, you'd need 2. So then you'd need a little splitter, which is a short connector, so you can put 2 microphones into one input. But they're relatively cheap. I mean, you can get those for $20-30 US each. So they're not a bad option. A USB mic is a really nice option. That's a bit more expensive, but that is more like a mini studio mic, but it has a USB connection, so that would be to use with a computer, and you can pop that in and essentially just put the microphone between you and the person you're talking to and get very nice sound quality out of that. Or if you have one of these recorders, as I showed, that will have a good inbuilt mic in. So if you have any budget for your podcast, probably the microphone would be the thing to think about. In terms of the software, so if these are all free software options, and you may have a voice note option app on your phone already, or you can download them. So I think this one's just called Voice Recorder, and I use that, and that's perfectly fine. Or on your laptop or computer, there's GarageBand, which comes free with most, I think all Mac, Apple Macs, and that you can record directly to that. Or there's Audacity. So GarageBand and Audacity are both recording and editing software, but you can stick your mic in, turn the software up and record directly into that. And Audacity is for Windows and for Mac, and again, that is free. Headphones, it's really useful to have headphones to be able to monitor what you're recording. There's things like if an aeroplane goes overhead, which we know there are some very noisy seagulls, which is always a problem that we have in BMA House in London, then it's just good to be able to know how much that's interfering with your sound and if you need to redo something. So some tips for recording. I would say the most important thing is to plan. It's much easier to spend that time planning than it is to get to the recording and have to do things over and over again, or try and fix them when you're editing. As Kieran says, he sends some questions to interviewees. I would say when you're planning for yourself, try not to write down exactly what you're going to say. So try not to make a script, because it can lead to you just reading it off, and that can sound quite robotic. So what I find is often best is just to make some bullet points. So it's you're being reminded of what you want to talk about, but not exactly what you want to say. And that often sounds more natural. And maybe think about timings as well. So you want to spend 5 minutes on this topic and 5 minutes on that topic, and that can help you keep to time and not end up with too much material. Find somewhere quiet to record, where you won't disturb. That can make a really big difference to, your kind of, how your concentration and focus when you're doing the podcast, and also the finished audio. So if you can find somewhere that's got carpets and curtains, it will sound a lot nicer, because you don't have that echo coming off wooden floors or walls and ceilings. Microphone placement is very important. So you want it fairly close to your interviewer and your interviewee, but not too close, because if you have it too close, you can get kind of popping from P's and some interference. So I would say if I was using a USB mic, you would have it on the desk in front of you, and try and point it towards your chin. So you don't want it kind of pointing directly at your mouth, because then you can get that popping and some interference. You sort of want it down here. And obviously if you've got a clip mic, that's easy enough just to pop on your shirt or your jumper. And one thing, if you're recording something and you're not sure if there's been, if the very noisy motorbike outside has made how much of a difference, or if someone, maybe you're not quite sure if they said something right, maybe they said the wrong word, or it wasn't clear enough, then I think it's much better to redo it than to try and fix it when you're editing. It's much quicker and easier. A few points on remote recording. So we're doing a lot of remote recording at the moment because of the pandemic and not being able to get into the studio. You can do it over Zoom. That's quite an easy option. There's a couple of settings that you need to make sure that you change. So you need to go into Zoom and make sure that the recording setting is enabled in the first place. And then there's also an option there to record people onto separate tracks. You get one audio track for each person that's on the Zoom meeting, rather than just one track with everyone together. And I've used Zoom a lot, and it's perfectly good. It's perfectly fine. If you're worried about quality, there is an option called Zencastr, which actually records people at their end, so you get slightly better quality audio because it's not compressing it to send it over the web. But there is a cost to that, and it's not as simple to use. So I definitely recommend Zoom in the first instance. And then we'll go through a few points on editing. So as I mentioned before, in the recording software, Audacity and GarageBand are also editing software. I won't tell you too much about this because there's so many videos that you can go and watch, and that's probably a much easier way to learn. But these are good basic programs where you will drop your audio into them, or you may have recorded it locally on there, and then really it's just about cutting it up and cutting out the bits that you don't want to get that final edit. Some tips for editing. So I would say the best way to start is always to go through and listen to everything that you've got first. So listen to your whole interview and think about what are the big chunks that you want to keep. So what is the stuff that's less interesting, or if you redid a question, there's stuff that you just don't want to include, then cut that out first, and then go through and cut for fluency or little mistakes, ums and ahs, that kind of thing. But I would say don't worry too much about a few grammatical mistakes or a few ums and ahs. It can be very tempting to go through and edit those all out and try to make it sound completely perfect in terms of grammar. But then you often lose, it can sound quite robotic, and you lose that conversational aspect to it. And actually, I think when people talk, we do make little mistakes and we do make ums and ahs, and people are actually quite used to that. So don't edit it too heavily in terms of that. If you do have some time, it's nice to add some music. There's a lot of copyright-free music that you can get. So pixabay.com is one place where you can go and download some short pieces of music. So, I mean, we just use, 5 to 10 seconds at the beginning or an end of the podcast, and that really adds just a bit of flavour, kind of adds to the atmosphere. And then the last tip I'd say is edit. Always remember that it's your listeners who you're making this for. So often there are things that you get that you think will be great beforehand, but sometimes they don't work out, but it can be tempting to keep them just because you put so much work into them. So do be a bit ruthless in terms of editing for what you think is best for your listeners. Yep, and I see we're getting a bit short of time, but I've just got a few points on publishing and promotion. So where to publish your podcast? There are so many platforms, websites out there which you can upload your podcast to and have them as the place that they're hosted. But many of them are subscription based. So some of those will have free options, but so they'll be limited. So you have only, certain hours of storage that you can use, or they're deleted after 90 days. There's a couple that I'd recommend called Anchor and Podcast.com. So those are the free options. So go and have a look at those in the first place. And I'd remember that actually it's not really the hosting platform that's most important, because that's just somewhere to upload your podcast to, and it's really the places like iTunes and Amazon Music which will share your podcast out. So I wouldn't worry too much about the hosting platform. I just find something that works for you and your budget, and go with that. So in the promotion is what they're called syndication apps. So I'm sure most of you, or a lot of you, will get your podcast through iTunes, Google, Spotify, or Amazon Music. And really those are the most important places to make sure that your podcast is available on. And there's a really easy process with all of those to get them added. As we talked about before, try and publish regularly if you can. I mean, that might mean teaming up with other people to publish podcasts that they produced in the same place, but whatever way you do it, it's a good thing to publish regularly. If you can make some artwork, that would be great. Just even something really simple to give your podcast a visual, give people a bit of a flavour of what it is, and to have something visual to share, particularly on social media, which is a really great way to push your podcast out. And here, this was just one example I thought I might share, which is a podcast I created a few years ago on quality improvements, and we used a variety of different formats in that to teach people about the basics of quality improvement. So the first episode was on the plan, do, study, act cycle. We recorded some talks with Don Berwick and Fiona Moss, another couple of examples, and included those. So if you did want to listen to something that is based on quality improvement, and to educate people about the processes behind it, do go and have a listen to that. So that was all I wanted to, that was all I had on my slides. Did you want to add anything to that, Kieran?
No, it's really, but I suppose in that section we're really lucky at BMJ because we've got a professional team of people behind us, producers who can produce it to really high quality, and then marketing and promotion people who can feed it out there. So if you can use a team, use your team to do all these various different things, it can make a big difference. If we have time, Harriet, we've got some very good questions coming in. One was, do I need permission to use some of these music recordings?
So there are, I mean, if you couldn't just choose any song that you wanted and put it on your podcast, because that would breach copyright. But there are quite a few websites that offer copyright-free music. So Pixabay is one. There's others out there. So if you search for copyright-free music, you will get plenty of good options that will come up.
There's another question here. We have audio recordings. Can we make podcasts out of them? Yeah. So if you already have recordings, do use what you've got already. So how I often do it is that if I've got some existing recordings